On a lengthy route in the dead of night, a certain and profound loneliness descends, a darkness that will never be experienced by most of us. This loneliness is a continuous companion for the truckers who make their living on the road. They traverse abandoned highways and barren terrain where the norms of everyday life can start to crumble. However, what occurs when that silence is broken by something genuinely terrifying? The most terrifying real-life stories from drivers who have looked into the darkness and seen something stare back have been gathered here at Verified Fears. You won't want to drive these highways alone. So before we dive into these 11 most unsettling genuine trucker horror stories, make sure you press the subscribe button and enable notifications. The rain was clinging, not simply falling. Dale has 27 years of experience driving long-haul trucks. Years later, he had discovered that rain might come in a dozen various forms. His cab's roof was pounded like a drum solo by the irate percussion-driven type. Some were foggy and gentle, like traveling through a cloud rather than a storm. But this was the worst kind. His windshield was covered with a cool, lingering mist that became the outside world into a hazy black and gray painting. It was the kind of rain that soaked into your bones and added to the sense of desolation that pervaded the unending miles of Highway 26 in Oregon. Fueled by lukewarm coffee and the repetitive drone of tires on damp asphalt, he had been pushing for 12 hours straight. His headlights' dual beams had reduced the landscape to a swath, slicing through the suffocating darkness and the repetitive the wipers are slapping. It was a lonely, hypnotic life, a bubble of light and warmth navigating a sea of frigid emptiness. He was dreaming about a hot dinner, a dry bed, and the comforting familiarity of a truck stop when he was startled out of his reverie by a flash of movement at the corner of his eye. There was a figure standing on the narrow shoulder. The young lady, who was hardly older than a girl, had long dark hair that was glued to the rain on her face. She was dressed in a light basic dress that seemed completely unsuitable for the climate. And even though she wasn't shivering, she kept her arms over her body. She simply stood there in the whirling mist, a pallid, immobile figure. She gave a half-hearted thumbs up. Dale was urged to continue by every instinct he had developed over almost 30 years of traveling. You never stop. Not for a lone man, who appeared to have sprung from the fog itself, not at this hour, and not in the middle of nowhere. Truckers' stories were filled with warnings about robberies, traps, and much more. But he hesitated because of something about her. It was the extreme immobility of her stance, the way she appeared to be more a part of the melancholy scenery than a distressed individual. He pictured his own kid, who was roughly her age, trapped in the cold by herself. His chest ached sharply at the thought. His foot eased off the accelerator against his better judgment. The darkness was pierced by the long, melancholy moan of the air brakes. She approached the passenger door with oddly leisurely movements, and he observed her in his side mirror as he drew the rig over about 50 yards past her. She didn't flee the rain by running. There was something extremely disturbing about the serene ease with which she moved. Leaning over, he pushed open the door. "Get in," he muttered, attempting to sound tough and commanding as a safeguard against his own folly. "Leave this awful weather behind." Without a word, she slid into the passenger seat. She was accompanied by a gust of cool air that smelled of damp leaves and newly turned soil. The chill has nothing to do with the weather outdoors. The cold was so intense that it caused Dale's arms to stand on end. He turned up the heat, but the sensation persisted. "Thank you," she offered. She said in a low voice, almost audible over the engine's hum. It sounded pure and clean, like little bells. Dale put the truck in drive and backed out into the highway, saying, "There's no place for a young lady to be out here on a night like this. Where you headed?" "Just up the road a ways," she said, staring at the windshield stained with rain. Dale scowled and said, "Number 14, Black Creek Lane." This was a road he knew like the back of his hand. He had hundreds of miles on it. "I can't claim to have heard of a Black Creek Lane in this area." "It's there," she stated in a bland voice without providing any additional context. In the faint light of the dashboard lights, he cast a quick glance her way. Her eyes were deep-set and dark, and her skin was nearly translucent. In a delicate vintage way, she was attractive. Now that he could see it more clearly, her clothing appeared to be a basic, unadorned item from a bygone age. No phone, no purse, and no bags of any type were present. She seemed to have just stepped onto the road after leaving the woods. He tried to break the stifling stillness between them by asking, "You run into any car trouble?" It got really chilly, really quickly, and I was just trying to get home when she muttered, "You could say that." Dale was a talker by nature, and silence on a long haul could drive a man insane, but he was at a loss for words. The cab was filled with an unspoken melancholy. The unnatural chills seemed to be coming straight from her, and the place that had once been his warm, safe haven now felt like a cold, claustrophobic tomb. They drove on for what seemed like an eternity, the miles vanishing into the fog, and he found himself clutching the steering wheel until his knuckles were white, his eyes darting between the road and his strange passenger, and he saw that not a drop of water had fallen from her soaked clothes or hair onto the seat or the floor mat. "It's just ahead," she said abruptly, her voice piercing his tense focus. Dale kept his eyes open for a road sign or anything that might indicate Black Creek Lane, but all he could see was the never-ending procession of towering pines lining the highway, their branches reaching out from the darkness like skeletal fingers. They were miles from the closest town, in the deepest section of the forest, with no houses, no lights, and not even a dirt track off the main road. Dale looked around and said, "Here, there's nothing here." She insisted, her voice still eerily calm. "This is the place." The rig moaned in protest, the tires screeching on the wet pavement as he swerved to avoid the animal, and then it was over in a second. The deer disappeared back into the woods, and Dale's heart was thumping against the brakes as he slowed the truck, and it darted out of the trees, its eyes wide and scared in the sudden glare of the headlights. His ribcage. He turned to his companion and took a big breath to regain his composure. "Are you okay?" The seat was empty as he asked, and Dale stared, his mind unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. He reached over with a shaking hand and pushed on the passenger door, which was still locked from the inside, but he hadn't heard the door open, hadn't heard anything over the screech of the brakes, and she was gone. The passenger seat was empty and dry, save for a tiny, damp patch in the middle, a cold spot that seemed to suck the warmth from his fingertips when he touched it. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him as he fumbled for the overhead light, filling the cab with a harsh, sterile glow. The cold in the cab was real, and he remembered her sweet, bell-like voice. But had he fallen asleep? Was this some sort of waking nightmare caused by exhaustion? The highway hypnosis old-timers told you about it. After killing the engine, he threw open his door, grabbed his strongest flashlight, and leaped down onto the wet road, his boots splashing in a puddle, the sudden silence startling. "Hello? Hey, where'd you go?" he shouted, his voice faint and tiny against the huge, quiet forest. There were no footprints on the muddy shoulder, no indication that anyone had been there at all. Just the sound of the wind, a low, melancholy moan as it rustled through, and he swept the flashlight's strong beam across the road into the thick wall of trees. The light pierced the rain and fog, revealing nothing but glistening leaves and dark, dripping branches. The tops of the pines, it sounded like it was whispering a name he couldn't quite make out. He climbed back into the cab, trembling, the sensation of being watched stinging the back of his neck. He turned on the engine and drove, pushing the rig faster than he should have on the slippery roads, desperate to put as much distance between. A middle-aged waitress with a kind, weary face poured him a cup of coffee without asking, and he stumbled, inside the bell over the door, jingling brightly, and sank onto a stool at the counter. He continued until he saw the warm, welcoming lights of a 24-hour dare in the next town. She continued, "You look like you've seen a ghost," in a warm voice, and Dale laughed shakily. "Perhaps I have. This is going to sound crazy, ma'am, but have you ever heard of a place called Black Creek Lane around here?" he inquired on a desperate hunch. "Oh, honey," the waitress began, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "There's no lane by that name." Her grin wavered as she carefully put down the coffee pot, her eyes clouding over. "No more. About 15 miles back, there's nothing but the old Black Creek Cemetery." As though disclosing a secret, she leaned in closer. "According to local folklore, On a night similar to this one, perhaps 60 or 70 years ago, a young woman named Eliza was going home along that section of highway. An unexpected storm struck, a freak blizzard. Before she could reach home, she froze to death. They claim that even in terrible weather, she continues to travel that route in an attempt to find a ride and complete her mission. Dale's grip on the coffee cup was unsteady. His face was emptied of blood. The cold, the name. With a terrifying surety, everything fell into place. He walked unsteadily back to his pickup after paying for the coffee he hadn't touched. He spent a considerable amount of time sitting in the driver's seat and gazing into the night. The taxi no longer felt like his own. The recollection of his silent passenger tormented him, making him feel violated. When he finally started the engine, he took a big, quivering breath. The wind increased as he drove out of the parking lot and back into the desolate highway, circling the taxi and continuing to blow as near and clear as though she were sitting next to him. A faint, ethereal murmur reached his ears. "I appreciate the ride. Let's go on to the second tale." The usual dull throb that had become the background music for Frank's life on the road ached throughout his body. It was the pain of sleeping in 2-hour blocks, of cheap coffee and greasy diner food, and of spending too many hours in one spot. He was in the middle of Nebraska's featureless, flat plains, where the terrain was a deeper shade of black and the sky was a vast, starless emptiness. A little break from the tedious grind had been promised by the rest stop sign, which had emerged from the shadows like a ghost. His 18-wheeler sighed as it nestled into the authorized truck parking space after he parked it there. The lot was almost deserted. A beat-up automobile with out-of-state license plates was parked close to the squat concrete restroom structure, and there was another vehicle parked at the far end, its cab dark and silent. A few humming sodium lamps filled the room with a sickly orange glow that did more to cast shadows than to chase away the gloom. He turned off the engine, and the only sounds to break the sudden emptiness were the ticking of his cooling engine and the distant hum of the highway. He simply sat there for a while, allowing the fatigue to consume him. The first rule of the road is to never push yourself when you're exhausted. It's how errors occur. This was really a standard stop. Check the tires, extend the legs, and perhaps reach beneath the seat to retrieve the thermos. It was something he had done 1,000 times. Out of habit, he looked around as he swung the heavy door open and his feet struck the cracked tarmac. You constantly look about you. It came to him as he glanced over the deserted picnic tables, the shadowy tree line defining the property's perimeter, and the other quiet cars. There was a shape at the very edge of the light, thrown by his own truck standing close to the tree line. It resembled a patch of blackness that was strangely darker than the surrounding night, although it wasn't very noticeable. It was a vertical slice of black against gray, towering and abnormally thin. Frank squinted, attempting to make sense of it with his tired eyes. A trunk from a tree? A strangely formed sign that he had never seen before. It was most likely nothing more than a ploy of the illumination. He was playing games with his weary head. He dismissed it with a shake of his head and started to move around. He used the steel toe of his boot to kick each of the 18 tires, the reassuring rhythm of the solid thump. As he ran his palm over the cool metal of his trailer and checked the seals, his thoughts began to stray to the logbook, the delivery schedule, and the kilometers that lay ahead. However, a peculiar tingling feeling crept up the nape of his neck, the sensation of being observed. It was an instinct from nature. Over the years, he had come to trust. He paused his examination and turned his gaze slowly back to the tree. The gloom remained. Not a single inch had changed, but a chilly knot tightened in Frank's abdomen. It appeared more defined and clearer now. The outline of a head and shoulders was almost visible to him, a long, lean figure that was unmistakably masculine. However, its dimensions are incorrect. His voice boomed in the silent lot as he whispered to himself, "Just a tree." He was worn out. It was just that. In the dark of night, he had witnessed more bizarre occurrences. Nevertheless, he noticed that he was walking a little more quickly, and his pattern began to feel more like a worried habit than a ritual. After completing his examination, he stepped back into his cab, which was relatively safe. With a firm, comforting thump, the door closed. He secured it. At rest stops, he never locked the door. His hand hesitated as he grabbed for his coffee thermos. His gaze was fixed on the mirror on the passenger side. From this different perspective, he could still make out the location of the shadow. It existed and was nearer. The treine was no longer there. Now it stood out in the open, midway between his truck and the woods. Even now, it was only a shadow, a man-shaped vacuum. However, it could not be mistaken. It had shifted. With his back turned, it had moved. Frank felt his heart pounding on his ribs. This was incorrect. His thoughts rushed, searching for a rational reason. Perhaps the person stretching their legs was from the other truck. However, why would they simply remain still in the dark? And why did they appear that way? The figure lacked solidity, with neither skin nor clothing reflecting the orange. Lamps. It was completely black. Anger washed over him, a feeling more manageable than the icy fear that was soaking into his bones. Did someone try to trick him? Some local kid seeking excitement. He whispered, "All right, you son of a bitch." As he reached for his high beam switch, he turned it on. The vacant stretch of grass was brutally clear as two strong white light beams cut through the night. Nothing was there. It's overgrown. Not a person, tree, or sign. A discarded fast food bag and weeds swirled in the unexpected light. Holding his breath tight in his chest, Frank looked. He had witnessed it. He was aware that he had. As soon as the world returned to its pale orange glow, he turned off the high beams. It had returned and was even closer. He let out a choking gasp. Not 20 yards from his passenger door, it was now standing on the asphalt at the border of the parking lot. It appeared to be unaffected by the light, as though it were only seen in the shadows, existing in a separate plane of reality. Now he could make out its shape. Unbelievably tall, perhaps 7 or 8 feet, with excessively long and slender limbs. It had a flat, light-absorbing silhouette, with no distinguishable characteristics. The paranoia struck him like a blow to the body. He wasn't worn out. He was going crazy. This was how it felt. The unending grins, the years of loneliness. Something inside him had finally been broken by them. Squeezing his eyes tight, he rubbed them vigorously with his palms until he noticed dots. He was experiencing delusions. He must be. He inhaled deeply and slowly before opening his eyes and making himself turn aside so he could concentrate on the inside of his taxi. The picture of his wife and children attached to the sun visor, the aged dashboard that was familiar, and the subtle scent of diesel and stale coffee. This actually happened. He ventured to look in the mirror again. It remained. It had required a series of steps. It wasn't moving. Every time he looked, it seemed to get closer. A terrible, silent, gradual advance. Frank struggled for the ignition key, his hands shaking. The engine sprang to life with a roar. A sound in the oppressive silence, a fierce, frantic sound. He had no intention of remaining here. He wasn't intending to sit and observe the approaching object, whatever it was. He had a straightforward plan: put the truck in gear, return to the highway, and continue driving till dawn. The truck's transmission groaned in protest as he shoved it into first gear. He needed to take another look. He had no desire to. His entire being begged him not to, yet he was powerless to stop himself. He looked at the passenger side window instead of the mirror. His blood froze. There it was, standing directly next to his truck. Its head, a featureless black oval that appeared to consume the light from the cab, was level with the top of the window. He might have touched it with his hand. There were no eyes or face, but he sensed a stare, followed by a fierce, evil pressure that smothered him. He was staring at an object that was out of place, a tear in the night's fabric. He didn't yell. He had the sound stuck in his throat, a knot of sheer anxiety, unpleasant and tight. He was not thinking. He responded. He stomped on the accelerator and yanked the steering wheel to the left. He sped out of the parking spot at a reckless speed that was out of proportion to the truck's size, causing the tires to screech as it lurched ahead. He didn't turn around. He was unable to. He thundered onto the on-ramp from the rest area, swerving very fast onto the highway, the distant, meaningless sound of a passing car's horn. His eyes were wide and unblinking as he drove for hours, with his foot down to the ground. Eventually, the sun started to rise, casting pink and gray hues across the eastern sky. But this did not provide any solace. He had been followed by the rest stop's darkness. Now it was inside him. Every shadow on the roadside appeared to be a tall, slender person. His heart leaped into his throat with each flare of light in his rearview mirror. Frank never again made a nighttime stop at a rest area. He would drive until he felt like he was about to pass out, only stopping at well-lit, busy truck stops with lots of other truckers. Even yet, he never felt secure in the brightness and the commotion. What he saw was real, he knew, and he was aware that it was still waiting, standing motionless in the desolate, forgotten nooks and crannies of the night. Once seen, a shadow cannot be unseen. Let's go on to the third tale. For Kevin, the CB radio was more than simply a piece of gear. It was a friend. The crackle and hiss of the radio was a welcome sound for a man who traveled America's most desolate roadways 20 days a month. It was, in the vast, deserted solitude of the open road, a smoke signal and a lifeline. He was constantly reminded that he wasn't completely alone in the world by the sounds of other people and lives. However, that comfort was about to give way to a distinct and horrifying kind of dread on this specific night as US Route 50, known as the loneliest route in America, passed through the middle of the Nevada desert. It was a night of absolute. The stars were a frigid, far-off spray against a canvas of pure black, and the moon was a sliver that provided no true light. Under the night sky, the desert loomed on all sides like a sleeping, quiet monster. The only lights were Kevin's headlights. It existed in this world, slicing a reality tunnel through an unending emptiness. The hypnotic rhythm of the journey had been ingrained in his bones after 10 hours of travel. Hoping to pick up a stray snippet of conversation, he reached over to adjust the squelch on his CB and took a gulp of lukewarm, old coffee. Normally, there would be nothing this far down the basin. You found yourself in a dead zone, too far away from any major road or town to receive a signal. It was the same tonight. A continuous, gentle hiss of static, the sound of an empty universe, came from the speaker. Although it was a solitary sound, it was recognizable. He kept it on since the white noise was better than the ear-splitting silence of the taxi. He continued to drive for an additional hour, with the odd spectral form of a yucca marking the only changes to the scenery. He flashed a plant in his high beams. Then there was a crackle. It made him jump in his seat since it was loud and harsh. It wasn't the typical interference pop. A breathy voice that seemed to curl out of the speaker and linger in the air where the road becomes thin was heard after it, sounding like a long, slow sigh. The voice sounded distorted, like it was coming from the bottom of a hole, a low, gritty whisper buried beneath layers of static. Kevin scowled while adjusting the dial. Most likely, it was really a skip, a strange atmospheric phenomenon that bounced a signal hundreds of miles away. It was still unsettling. The words were both odd and quite clear. He was ready to brush it off when it reappeared, a bit more lucid this time. Just bone and salt, no water. Kevin felt a shiver run down his back. Trucker talk was not what this was. Neither Nice Buddy nor 104 were present. It was profoundly unnerving, poetic, and even biblical. He picked up the microphone. His own voice sounded loud and alien as he said, anyone on this channel? You're coming in broken? The quiet hiss of static was the sole response. His hand hovered above the microphone while he waited. Nothing. He gave a headshake. His thoughts were deceiving him. Lack of sleep was a powerful drug. He tried to concentrate on the road while taking another drink of coffee. After 20 minutes, the radio began to crackle once more. This time the voice was higher pitched and sounded almost childlike, yet it still had the same watery, distorted feel. The box contains the rabbit. The box contains the rabbit. The phrase was repeated 3 times, each time sounding more desperate than the one before. Whispering to himself, "The rabbit is in the box," Kevin said. He was transporting machine. Parts from Sacramento to Salt Lake City in a sealed container. No bunny was present. It was absurd, but his skin crawled at the disembodied voice's utter panic. As he spoke into the microphone, "This is KW 542 northbound on 50. His voice was strained. A childish voice said, "Who's on this channel? What's your 20? And then stopped suddenly. The first voice, the gruff, deep whisper, took its place. "KW 542, we see you." The Sandman appears. The blood in Kevin froze. He had not used his call sign, KW 542, for years, and his handle, his road moniker, was the Sandman. That name was only known to the old-timers and his closest traveling companions. Handles were no longer used. Not at all. How could anyone know his name out here in this dead zone? His chest started to swell with panic. His fingers fumbled for the volume knob as he reached to turn off the CB. A third voice spoke before. He could touch it. Arrived. It had the same ethereal, remote air as the others, but it was a woman's voice, sweet and serene. "He is grabbing the dial. Our song doesn't appeal to him." As though the radio had been redone, Kevin grabbed his hand back. They were aware of his actions. They were observing him. He glanced wildly at the road behind him in his mirrors, and the darkness beyond the desert's emptiness. Nothing was present. There were no other trucks or headlights, only the suffocating blackness. He was all by himself. Without even using the microphone, he shouted into the taxi, "Who is this?" With a dry chuckle that echoed across the speaker, the gruff voice asked, "What do you want?" "We want to talk. It's been so long, so lonely out here. Tell us about the coffee, Kevin. Is it cold yet?" He said, gazed at the cup he was holding. His name. They were aware of his name. He felt sick to his stomach. It wasn't a joke. There was no signal skip here. There was more to this. Something evil and impossible. Once his haven of seclusion, the cab of his vehicle suddenly felt like a cage, and these voices were inside it with him. She said, "Tell us about your daughter." Voice cut off. How could they know that his 7-year-old daughter Sarah's room was covered in her crayon drawings of horses? Does she still like to draw pictures of horses? Kevin choked back a sob. He slammed his fist on the dashboard and said, "Leave me alone." The child's voice started to giggle, a terrible distorted sound that seemed to twist and reverberate inside. The little space. He's afraid. He had never mentioned her on the radio. He kept his home life and his road life totally apart. The Sandman is afraid of the dark, so he seized the entire CB unit and yanked it with all his effort. The voices continued to pour from the hanging speaker, which was no longer linked to the main console, despite the wires sparking and tearing. "You can't shut us out." The chorus of voices appeared to exclaim in unison, their words blending into a cacophony of whispers. But the unit was alive without power. "The airwaves are us. Long before your roads sliced into our peace, we were here." The road ahead started to blur through the tears of fear that were welling up in his eyes, and Kevin was losing his sense of reality as his heart pounded frantically against his ribs. He heard voices swirling around him, whispering his name, his wife's name, the name of the street where he grew up, and stories from his early years that he had never shared with anyone. It seemed as though they were removing the layers of his life and identity and broadcasting them into the desert night. Then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. For a brief minute, the cab was filled with the agony of the whispering voices. They were not merely observing him. They were inside his skull, being dissected by these invisible, all-knowing things. The next was the rumble of the tires and the hum of the engine, the dangling speaker mute, the stifling, vigilant feeling gone, replaced by a ringing silence that was somehow creepier than the noise, and Kevin looked up. He had crossed some invisible threshold because he could see the glittering lights of a town in the distance, and he could see the first faint glow of dawn reaching the horizon ahead of him, a thin line of orange and purple that pushed back against the oppressive darkness. He drove straight through the town, not slowing down until he came to a brightly lit, round-the-clock truck stop on the opposite side, and he parked into the lot, his hands shaking so badly he'd never used a CB radio again, tearing the whole system out of his truck and throwing it in a dumpster in Salt Lake City. but he could never get rid of the voices. He sat there for a long time, bathed in the artificial daylight of the parking lot, the sun now rising fully behind him. Let's move on to our fourth story. They remained in his memory, a chilling reminder of his journey down America's most lonely road. He discovered that night that some places are quiet because something ancient is listening, waiting for a stray signal to lock onto, waiting for a lone traveler to whisper its terrible secrets to. After 15 years of driving, Mark had learned that the world worked on a straightforward set of principles. Logbooks required honesty, diesel engines needed maintenance, and he was a creature of habit and logic. And no matter how long a highway was, it always had a beginning and an end. He was a map man, a navigator who took solace in the interstate system's predictable geometry. He was transporting a load of produce from Des Moines to Denver, a route he had traveled so many times that he could identify his progress by the particular pattern of asphalt cracks. He was deep in the central Nebraska plains tonight, a section of I-80 so level and straight that if you were a bigger idiot than him, you could tape the steering wheel down and take a nap. The fog came suddenly, and it wasn't the soft creeping mist that occasionally rose from the fields at dusk, but rather a thick and strangely. The fog was a solid, pearlescent wall that muffled all sound, including the familiar roar of his own engine. One moment Mark could see the distant glimmer of starlight, but the next his reality had shrunk to the 20-foot bubble illuminated by his headlights. The world was swallowed whole by the silent blanket that descended upon the highway. At 10 and 2, he lowered his pace, his hands grasping the wheel, his eyes trying to discern the white lines on the road, reducing it to a low, anxious hum. It was like driving through milk. A familiar sign appeared up ahead, its green and white lettering shimmering faintly. A slight smile came to Mark's face as he recognized the location, a traditional old-school truck stop with a huge, goofy statue of a prairie dog wearing a cowboy hat in front. The Prairie Dog Diner. World's best coffee, next exit. He had made a couple of stops there over the years, and since it was a good landmark, he knew he was on time. He drove for what he thought was a solid hour, passing the exit, the warm lights of the diner, a faint, fuzzy smear to his right, and his eyes. He should have been well past the diner, heading toward the turnoff for Highway 30. He was beginning to feel the first stabs of an unnerving disorientation when another green and white sign appeared out of the mist. The Prairie Dog Diner, world's best coffee, next exit. He was locked on the road, his world a monotonous cycle of white lines appearing and disappearing, and the fog showed no signs of abating. The road was a straight line, so he couldn't have gotten twisted around. He must have miscalculated the time, perhaps dozing off for a moment. Mark blinked, his brow furrowing. He shook his head, blaming the hypnotic effect of the fog, and continued driving, a little more alert this time, a little less certain, hoping for a weather report or just a human voice to break the oppressive silence. Or maybe there were two diners with the same name and a similar sign. It was a stretch, but it was a more acceptable explanation than the alternative. Nothing. He switched between AM and FM frequencies, but the speaker just made a hollow, lifeless hiss. He took out his phone, but there was no service. Naturally, he checked his GPS, and the screen displayed the map's flat gray grid, but the tiny blue arrow that, as if he had driven off the edge of the world. A cold, heavy feeling settled in the pit of his stomach, and the cab, his rolling office, and his home suddenly felt small and confining. His truck was gone, replaced by a single pulsing blue dot in a sea of gray with no roads, no towns, nothing. The sun should have been considering rising by now, but the sky remained a uniform, lightless gray, indistinguishable from the fog-choked land. His fuel gauge hadn't moved, and he drove for another hour, then 2, concentrating on the simple mechanics of keeping the truck on the road, a fragile shell against the vast, unknowable emptiness outside. This time, the sight of the sign, the Prairie Dog Diner, sent a shockwave of unadulterated terror through him. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a mistake. He was stuck. It was still pointing at just over half a tank, precisely where it had been 3 hours earlier. As he passed the exit, he gazed at the diner, where the enormous prairie dog monument appeared to be staring directly at him. He was driving in a loop when a cold sweat appeared on his brow. He smiled suddenly, a sarcastic, mocking grin. Panic struck, a frantic clawing sensation in his chest telling him that he couldn't just keep driving in circles and that he needed to do something. He brought the truck to a screeching stop in the center of the deserted freeway. It was a nerve-wracking 15-point turn to turn the huge rig around on the tiny highway, but he had to think about it. He would turn around and travel in the opposite direction until he broke free of this. He finally turned around and pressed the accelerator, a new sense of purpose stabilizing his hands as he drove with a desperate intensity, his eyes searching for anything different, any break in the pattern. But all he saw was the fog, the never-ending shrill cry of the trailer's warning beeper. After an hour of driving west on Interstate 80, he saw a sign for the Prairie Dog Diner rise from the fog. A deep, guttural scream ripped from his mouth. It was impossible. He was headed to the opposite direction. The diner ought to have been behind him. He was going crazy. The loneliness, the fog, the never-ending road had finally made him lose his mind. He began to see objects in the whirling fog at the edge of his headlights. Tall, thin creatures that appeared to move. He was a ghost in a ghost machine, haunting a section of highway that existed outside of time. He didn't know how long he drove. Time had lost all meaning and was only a constant, unending present of fear and confusion. He stepped in with his truck, figures that would disappear the moment he tried to focus on them. The diner he passed, again and again, seemed a little more rotten, a little more sinister each time. The lights in the windows flickering and dying. The prairie dog statue covered with what appeared to be vines and moss, its happy face peeling away to reveal a dark, rotting wood underneath. And he was broken. Tears of sheer horror and sorrow poured down his cheeks as he leaned over the steering wheel. He was no longer concerned. His mind was a humming, numb nothingness, and he simply kept his foot on the pedal. Now he was one of the road's ghosts, part of it. When the sign for Prairie Dog Diner came for the 10th or even the 100th time, he became aware of a change. The letters were not the same. They were jumbled and twisted. It now read, "The world ends here," rather than "World's best coffee." Something broke within of him. It was a last instinctive survival mechanism. He swerved the vehicle and pointed it straight at the exit ramp with a yell of anger. He would never pass it again. The diner was his destination. It had to be better than this never-ending torment, but he had no idea what he would discover. His truck groaned in protest as he thundered down the ramp. The fog disappeared as soon as his tires struck the exit ramp and exited the freeway. It did not disperse or thin. In a moment, it vanished. The midday sun's dazzling, blinding radiance surrounded him. His truck skidded to a stop when he stomped on the brakes. His heart thumping, he glanced about. He was on the shoulder of the westbound lane of Interstate 80. The sky was a clear, dazzling blue. The temperature was warm. He checked the time on his dashboard. The time was 1:30 p.m. He had lost over 12 hours. He turned to face the exit. The diner was absent. No statue was present. Only a shabby, outdated billboard was visible. Years of sun faded its message. There was only a single word visible to him. Greetings. He checked his gasoline indicator. It was nearly empty. For a long period, Mark sat there. The sense of fragility and alienation in the familiar environment. Even though he was free, a piece of him remained there, on that impossibly long road in the fog. He had traveled on an endless highway where the laws of the earth did not govern him. That the road would be waiting for him if he ever passed that way again, he knew with a surety that would torment him for the rest of his life. Let's go on to the fifth tale. Flights of fancy were not S's style. With a network of lines around, his eyes that told of 1,000,000 miles of asphalt and innumerable sunrises. He was a strong, practical man who had been driving for 40 years. With a cynical groan, he discounted all the urban legends and ghost stories he had heard at the truck stops. He constantly claimed that the true monsters were blown tires, black ice, and the idiot in the RV who didn't realize it takes 18 wheels to stop. He lived in a world of logistics, mechanics, and real-world threats. But S was about to face a peril that was both horrifyingly real and frustratingly unexplained as darkness started to flow over the sky, illuminating the undulating, hills of West Virginia in hues of bruised orange and purple. He was driving on Route 33, a two-lane blacktop that wound like a serpent through the Appalachian woods back in the day. Far from the antiseptic, glaring uniformity of the freeway, it was a lonely area. In this instance, the road was overrun by trees whose branches interlocked above to create a thick canopy that hastened the darkness. You could travel on that road for an hour and not see another person, which is why he saw the automobile right away. As he emerged from a steep turn, he noticed a pair of headlights that appeared in his rearview mirror, seemingly emerging from the darkness. At first, he didn't give it any thought. It was most likely a local, eager to avoid his sluggish climbing apparatus. He moved steadily, anticipating that the automobile would suddenly pull out and pass him. However, it didn't. It simply remained in his mirror, a steady presence at a distance of roughly 50 feet. 10 minutes later, S became irritated. With their headlights glaring at him incessantly and annoyingly, the motorist was tailgating him. A universal gesture to back off, he mumbled, "All right, buddy, come on," and lightly tapped his brakes. As it slowed, the car's headlights briefly dimmed before slowly rising again to their starting position. On his bumper was a leech. A sigh of resignation and frustration mixed together. He slowed down and hugged the shoulder to give the automobile plenty of space to pass until he came across a brief straight section of road. The invitation was unambiguous. S braced himself for the sound of the car's engine as it rushed by, having moved into the oncoming lane. Rather, it simply remained there, slipping back in behind him after a few seconds of traveling parallel to his cab. S felt a chill go down his neck. It was odd, strange, not just impatient. In an attempt to catch a glimpse of the motorist, he looked at his rearview mirror once more. The vehicle was an older sedan junker, perhaps a Ford Taurus or something, its hue fading amid the encroaching dusk. The driver was only a dim outline on the dirty glass. S narrowed his eyes, looking for anything, a face, a hat, anything. Then he caught sight of them. The eyes. He could see a set of eyes looking straight at him through the glare and the dirt. They appeared to catch the light from his own dashboard in an unusual way, and they were wide and unblinking. The remainder of the face was hidden from his view, the piercing, unblinking stare, not the mouth or nose. S was startled by the intense predatory silence in the look, as though a circuit had been completed between them. His heart began to beat a little faster, and he hastily averted his gaze. He was dreaming, he reassured himself. He couldn't get rid of the feeling, even if it was just his mind filling in the blanks and the light playing games. Behind him, the car was more than simply a car. The creature was staring into the back of his head with its eyes. They kept up their eerie, wordless dance for the next 30 minutes. The car's headlights would stick to S like iron filings to a magnet as they both accelerated. The automobile would slow down as he did, but it would never pass or fall back. The mimicry was flawless and horrifying. It was growing dark on the road. The woods form a solid black wall on either side. Normally a source of solace, the sense of loneliness was now a source of growing fear. Nobody else was out here. No assistants, no witnesses. His pragmatic intellect frantically sought a logical explanation. Was a police officer waiting for him to make a mistake in an unmarked vehicle? No. By now, a police officer would have stopped him. Was it anger from the road? Had he not interrupted others or provoked another motorist in any way? It must have been a joke. Some local children have a perverse sense of humor. But that stare was intense. I didn't think it was a joke. It had the feel of a hunt. He made the decision to press the matter. A tiny, on the right, was a gravel turnoff leading to a picturesque overlook. He might lose them, but it seemed unlikely. The huge rig made a sudden, lurching turn into the dirt road as he twisted the wheel, and hit his turn signal at the last second. The trailer groaned as it was pushed off the smooth surface, and the truck objected. He turned off the engine and stopped his headlights, leaving the overlook in almost complete darkness. With his breath trapped in his chest, he sat in the abrupt, deafening silence, and he listened. On the main road, he heard the sedan slow down. He watched as its headlights continued down the highway, sweeping past the overlook's entrance. S felt a surge of relief that was so strong it made him feel lightheaded. It was successful. They had vanished. He had been going overboard, allowing the desolate road to affect him. With a trembling breath, he started the engine again when he heard a noise that chilled him to the bone. The sound of tires crunching over gravel. The vehicle hadn't continued its journey. It had halted just outside the entrance, extinguished its own lights, and was now rolling into the overlook after him in silence and slow motion. A wave of icy fear took the place of the relief. There was no game here. This was intentional. About 100 feet away, he saw the black silhouette of the car slide to a stop, blocking the only path out. He was confined. His large fingers were clumsy with adrenaline as he scrambled for his phone. No assistance. From the television, the phrases made fun of him. He was by himself with them. The tiny lot was flooded with bright, dazzling light when he turned on his highlights. The vehicle sat motionless, its engine running at a low, threatening RPM. He didn't have to look through the dirty glass to see the driver. There was the tangible, evil pressure of those eyes on him. He activated his air horn, and the loud blast reverberated through the quiet mountains. It was a challenge to the object in the automobile, a frantic, savage cry for assistance. His horn was met only by the guttural snarl of the sedan's engine revving, and then it began to move. It moved inexorably and slowly onward until it was inches from his bumper. It then came to a halt. For a long, painful minute, they sat. In the dark, two monsters are engaged in combat. Fear and incredulity swirled through S's head. What were they seeking? Would they attempt to enter his taxi? White-knuckled, he reached for the tire iron he kept wedged next to his seat. The headlights on the vehicle flashed once, twice, and then it swerved, slowly backing away. However, it did not depart. It became an almost undetectable shape in the darkness as it pulled to the side and its lights turned out. Observing and waiting. He couldn't stay here, S realized. He was a helpless victim. His rig's size and strength were his sole advantages. He needed to return to the path. He inhaled deeply before putting the truck in gear and pressing the throttle in the direction of the exit. He anticipated that the automobile would attempt to ram him or impede him. It had no effect. It simply let him go and sat there. His heart was racing as he turned back onto the highway. It might be over, he thought. However, the headlights of the vehicle flickered back on as he glanced in his mirror, and it departed the overlook, settling into its familiar, ominous position just behind him. The match was far from over. It had just moved into a new, scarier stage. They hadn't attacked him by trapping him in the overlook. To prove to him that they could, they had trapped him. A hard, frigid anger took the place of the terror. S has had enough of being the victim. His gaze shifted from the road to the mirror as he continued to drive for another mile. He spotted his opportunity. A bridge with only one lane that crosses a deep gulf. His pickup could hardly fit on the ancient iron truss bridge. He slowed sharply when he got closer to the bridge. The unexpected sedan also had to reduce its speed. S slammed on the brakes as his cab pulled into the bridge. The huge truck came to a stop, blocking the entrance entirely. With a sickening crunch of metal, the vehicle crashed into the back of his trailer with little time to stop. There was silence for a while. The car then attempted to reverse, and S heard the noise of its engine. He reversed his own truck and pushed it back, trapping the smaller, intrepid vehicle to the bridge's guardrail. Metal moaned and screamed. As the driver attempted to break free, he experienced a succession of desperate, frenzied bumps against his trailer. Then everything fell silent with one last, thunderous snap. S waited, his body shaking and his breath labored. He shifted the truck into drive cautiously and moved off the bridge. He saw the vehicle in his rearview mirror. It was pressed up against the bridge's opening, steam gushing out of its twisted hood. Its headlights were flashing like a dying eye, and one was broken. The door on the driver's side was ajar a little. He didn't wait for anyone to go. He floored it, separating himself from the wreck as much as he could. He continued for 50 meters, not until he pulled into a huge travel center's bright, busy lot. With unsteady legs, he limped out of his truck and proceeded to check the rear of his trailer. The truck was perfect except for a dent in the back bumper. His fingertips touched something lodged in the bent metal as he raked his hand over the damage. A tiny piece of folded paper was jammed into a crevice. He took it out and unfolded it, his heart thumping. It was a crayon drawing by a child. It showed a large truck on a road with a small, shabby-drawn automobile following it. Two big black circles were drawn in the shape of eyeballs on the car's windshield. One terrifying word appeared beneath the drawing in jumbled block characters. Let's proceed to our sixth story shortly. The employment offer had arrived in the form of a whispered phone call from a guy who knew a guy, not a dispatcher or corporate load board. Ray's wife's medical expenses were piled on his kitchen table like a monument to his own failure, and his rig was about to be repossessed. He required a miracle. There was no miracle from the man on the phone. He presented a remedy in the form of a substantial sum of money. It was an easy task. Drive a sealed container to an unmarked, sandy airstrip in the middle of the Arizona desert from a forgotten warehouse district in Gary, Indiana. There were only two guidelines. He was not to ask any questions, and he was not to crack the container's seal. He met the two men at the warehouse, weren't the type of men who grinned. They had flat, lifeless eyes that seemed to absorb the light, and they were constructed like refrigerators. The crisp $100 bills felt heavy and filthy in his hand when they gave him half of the total amount up front. They observed the loading of the container, a typical 20-foot steel box, onto his flatbed. The door was unremarkable and streaked with rust, but it was sealed the way Ray had never before seen. It was more than a padlock. It was fastened with a strong iron rod that had been welded into position and a number of thick industrial-look fasteners. Machine parts are mentioned in the manifest. Among with a grumble, the men gave him a clipboard. All you need to know is that. It was obvious from his tone that this was a demand rather than a recommendation. Ray only nodded, his lips parched. Although he was aware that he was going too far, carrying a ghost burden for shady characters, the money in his pocket served as a potent analgesic for his conscience. Telling himself it was just another job, just another box, he signed the paperwork, dragged his rig out of the dilapidated warehouse, and pointed it west. It was just that for the first day. Under a dismal, uncaring sky, he drove across Illinois and into Missouri, the miles passing slowly. Behind him, the container was motionless and silent, simply lifeless weight. He drank harsh coffee from his thermos, ate while on the go, and pushed the idea of what he was doing to the back of his mind. The only thing that mattered was the money. Late on the second night, as he was passing into Oklahoma, the first sound was heard. There was a slight thump of rhythm. Thump, thump. At first, he thought it was a tire anomaly or a loose piece of equipment because it was so soft. But it was constant and intentional and seemed to match the pounding of his own nervous heart. He switched off the radio and listened. Carefully. Once more, there it was. Something heavy sounded like it was moving within the container. He looked in his mirrors. The chains taught that the container was safe. Most likely, it was simply the burden settling. This time he turned the radio up a bit more. However, the uneasy seed had already been sown. He found himself listening, waiting for the sound every time he turned a corner or bumped into something. The sound started to shift as the hours passed. The pounding was changed to a scraping sound. The sound was relentless and high-pitched, like nails slowly moving across a metal surface. Scree-scrape. He felt his teeth tense at the sound. A sound that evoked images of desperate animals trapped in a trap. Ray attempted to explain it. The edges of the machine components must be crisp. As the vehicle moved, they were only rubbing up against the box's interior. It was an entirely reasonable answer. However, that didn't seem reasonable. There was something about the sound, a wild intensity that seemed uncomfortably natural. Somewhere in the panhandle of Texas, he stopped into a dark, deserted rest area. As he killed the engine, the sound of the planes racing in was silent. He had to make sure. He was forced to. With his boots crunching on the gravel, he reached for his flashlight and made his way to the rear of his trailer. His light beam played over the massive bolts and the welded bar as he stood in front of the sealed container. There was no sound at all in the night, nothing banging, no scraping. He touched the chilly steel of the container door with his ear. He kept his take a breath and listen. The only sound in his ears for a full minute was the roar of his own blood. He heard it just as he was ready to back off and label himself a fool. It was a whimper. He wasn't sure he had heard it at all because it was so weak and muffled by the thick steel. However, it was present, a whimpering, low, sorrowful sound, perhaps the sound of a youngster or a dog. A chilling sense of foreboding swept over him. What did this box contain? In his memory, he saw the men's faces and their lifeless, icy eyes. Suddenly, the money in his pocket felt like a stone pulling him down. He pounded the door with his fist. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Hello, is anyone in there?" The whining ceased. Compared to the loudness, the ensuing silence was more ominous and frightening. It had heard him, whatever was within. It was paying attention. Returning to his cab, he staggered. He had a frantic storm in his head. These were not pieces of a machine. This was something alive. A person? Were they trying to smuggle someone? Or was it worse? The money crossed his mind. His wife was on his mind. He reflected about the men in the warehouse and the implicit danger that hovered over them. With a strong foot on the pedal, he started the truck and backed off onto the highway, seemingly able to outrun the reality of what he was transporting. He was unable to outrun the noises, though. They began once more, louder and more frantic. The sobbing had altered, and the scratching had become frantic, a continuous, furious scraping that appeared to come from all sides of the container at once. Rye felt his determination start to falter as it cried quietly and called out a word. That sounded more like Mama, sounding less like an animal and more like a human infant. Each mile he traveled was an additional mile of collusion. He participated in this. That box contained a piece of whatever horror was inside. The moral burden was become intolerable. What if a youngster perished inside because he was too afraid or avaricious to take any action? He was aware that he could never remove the stain, cleanse his soul. He had reached his breaking point by the time he arrived at the barren expanses of New Mexico. The desert was covered with long, unsettling shadows as the sun began to set. The container's weeping had become into a sad scream that never stopped. He was at his breaking point. Forget about the money. Forget about the men. Miles from anywhere on a long, deserted stretch of road, he pulled the truck over. He exited with a grim determination on his face. He reached into his toolbox and took out a long steel crowbar and heavy-duty bolt cutters. He was getting the box open. He began by addressing the bolts. He had to use all his might to break them because they were corroded and thick. The silence of the desert was filled with the sound of the metal grunting and then giving way with a loud crack. The noises inside the container ceased as he worked. The abrupt quiet was unsettling. The inhabitant appeared to know exactly what he was doing and to be holding its breath while waiting. The welded bar was all that remained. He slammed his whole body weight against it and wedged the crowbar's point under it. The metal let out a moan. A bitter cry of effort tore from his throat as he pushed once again. The weld cracked with a shriek of tormented steel. The bar fell to the floor with a crash. They opened the door. For a moment, he stood there with his heart thumping and his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hand was shaking as he reached for the handle. He inhaled deeply one last time before pulling. There was a deep moan of mourning when the massive steel door swung open. With his body ready for whatever he could discover, Ray pointed his flashlight into the shadowy interior. There was nothing in the container. Totally empty. There were no people, no animals, and no mechanical parts. Only a bare 4 naked walls and a steel floor. His mind straining to make sense of what he was seeing, he swept the flashlight beam over the interior. From where had the noises originated? Had he lost his mind? Then something on the inside of the door he had just opened caught his flashlight beam. His blood was chilly as he took a step closer. The door's whole interior was covered in deep, desperate scratches that seemed to have been made by something with iron claws tearing into the solid steel. They weren't human characteristics. They had the scars of a savage, confined beast. And one dreadful word, scrawled in letters a foot high, was at the very center of the door. "Thank you." With his head spinning, Ray staggered back and landed on the dusty shoulder of the road. The cries, the noises, everything had been a ruse, a lure. There was no reason to save a prisoner. It was a predator that had to go free. He hadn't been transporting goods. He had just turned a locked cage that he had been a key driving throughout the nation. Without even closing the container door, he hurried back to his cab. He didn't look back as he drove off. Leah, the gaping, empty box on his trailer, a reminder of his terrible error. He never visited the airport. He continued to drive till the petrol ran out in his rig. He then abandoned it on the roadside, put the keys in the ignition, and simply left. He accepted the blood money, but it didn't make him any happier. Because Rye is now compelled to listen whenever the wind howls through the desolate regions of the world. He hears a slight scraping noise, for the whimper of a child on the wind. He is aware of what he released from that box, and he is aware that it is free and exists someplace in the dark. Let's proceed to the 8th tale. The universe begins to fray at the edges when one reaches a point of tiredness that transcends simply being tired. George had ventured far into that region. The cities were only labels on a map, 100 miles apart, and the horizon was a flat, merciless line as he pushed into the vast, deserted quarter of West Texas. His fuel light, a small amber beacon of his own folly, had been on for the past 40 miles. His gut was a pit of pain and hollowness. He was paying the consequences now, creeping along a dark highway in a steel cage, after miscalculating and pushing too hard, running on regret and fumes. He noticed a light just as a true physical panic started to set in. It began as a dim, fuzzy glimmer that soon resolved into a dazzling neon splash against the suffocating blackness. The Starlight Diner, always open, was written in a cheery looping script on the sign. There was a blinking, buzzing coffee cup beneath the text. It was a wonder in the middle of nowhere, an oasis. During his dozen trips down this path, George had never seen a diner. He reasoned that it must be new, an overwhelming sense of relief that nearly made him cry. After pulling off the freeway, he entered a parking lot that was unexpectedly well-paved but deserted. The diner itself was a traditional prefabricated structure made of glass and chrome, and it glowed with a harsh, almost medical light that was painful to his eyes. It appeared immaculate, unaffected by the surrounding desert's dust and deterioration. The first thing he noticed when he got out of his taxi was the silence. There was no distant highway noise, no hum from the neon sign, and no sound of kitchen fans. The air seemed heavy and oddly still. When he pushed the door open, the bell above it did not jingle. There was absolutely no sound. The white linoleum flooring were polished to a mirror sheen, and the interior was as bright as the exterior. A jukebox stood idle in the corner, and a long red vinyl counter ran the length of the space. Although the property was immaculate, it had the feel of a museum exhibit, sterile and unused. There were a few more customers strewn over the booths. A man reading a newspaper in an old suit. A young pair is seated across from one another, holding hands without exchanging words. An old woman looking into a coffee cup. As he walked in, they all looked up, their movements precisely timed. They did not nod or smile. In perfect harmony, they simply gazed at him with a calm, unsettling emptiness in their eyes before going back to their silent pursuits. "Take a seat anywhere." "Hun," some voice said. It was the waitress, a woman who appeared to have walked straight out of a postcard from the 1950s. She wore a clean pink uniform, had a beehive of blonde hair, and a broad red-lipped smile that was just too lovely. Her eyes were a flat doll-like blue, and it never faltered or touched them. The vinyl felt cool on George's skin as he slid onto a stool at the bar. "Evening," he muttered, feeling oddly self-conscious. "You got any apple pie and only a coffee?" "Best in Texas," the waitress replied in a silky monotone voice before gliding off with her feet making no sound on the polished floor and her motions unnervingly fluid. George waited, taking in the scene. The young couple had not moved, their hands clasped on the table like a pair of wax sculptures. The old woman was still staring into her coffee, her face completely blank. The man's newspaper had no headlines, only thick blocks of unreadable text. The air was heavy with a sense of deep wrongness, as a low, distorted tune started to come from the jukebox. A familiar melody played so slowly and at such a low pitch that it sounded like a funeral dirge. The waitress came back and set the pie and coffee in front of him. The coffee was black and steaming, but it possessed no scent. The pie slice was a masterpiece with a perfectly latticed crust and a dusting of cinnamon, resembling a photograph of a pie. "Thanks," he said in a rough, unnatural voice, and the waitress continued to smile, her vacant, fixed smile shifting to the end of the bar, where she started cleaning a coffee pot that was already shining. George sipped the coffee, which was hot but nothing at the same time. It was like drinking hot water, with no taste, bitterness, or warmth. After scowling, he bit into the pie, and the fork passed through it without any trouble. It was the culinary equivalent of static, with a soft, yielding texture in his mouth, but no apple, spice, or sweetness. The man in the suit turned a page of his blank newspaper. The pair stayed immobile, and he looked at the other customers, chewing and swallowing, but absorbing nothing. A chill of dread crept up his spine. He looked at the big round clock on the wall, the second hand not sweeping but stuck between the 7 and the 8, twitching almost like a marionette. The woman finally raised her cup to her lips, but her movements were stiff and jerky like a marionette. No one was actually eating or drinking, just going through the motions. Slowly. He had to leave since time had been broken, his pulse thumping against his ribs. He fumbled for his cash in his pocket. "What do I owe you?" His voice trembled a little as he asked. With an unwavering smile, the waitress walked back over and said, "There's no charge," in her melodious, flat voice. "It's on the house?" She leaned closer, her doll-like eyes staring into his. "You were so hungry. You'll be back. They all come back." He moved himself away from the counter, his stool scraping noisily against the floor as she said, "This was not a diner but a trap, a roach motel for the souls of weary travelers." Her words struck him like a physical blow. The patrons looked at him again, their attitudes unaltered, their dead eyes following his every move, and he didn't utter another thing before turning and running away, pushing the silent door open, and staggering out into the darkness. It was the first truly startling sound he'd heard since he'd come. The engine screamed to life, a beautiful, booming, real sound, and he pushed the vehicle into gear and drove out of the truck without turning around. He scurried into the cab of his truck, his hands shaking so much that he could hardly get the key into the ignition. He drove for a mile, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, the diner's lights still visible, a stark, unholy glow in the darkness, spraying gravel in the parking lot, not caring if he ripped his tires to pieces. Then he crested a small hill, and when he looked in his mirror again, the light was gone. He continued driving for 5 more minutes before his curiosity and a persistent feeling of incredulity overcame him. He found a location to reverse the large rig and made his way back, because he had to be certain that it had been real. He slowed as he got closer to the location where the diner should have been. It was as though the Starlight Diner had never been there. No building, no parking lot, no buzzing neon sign, just a flat, deserted area, speckled with scrub brush and illuminated by the moon's dim light. The turnoff he had taken was an old, overgrown dirt track that ended abruptly after 50 feet in a thicket of mesquite. There were no foundations or signs of a building, just dust and weeds that had obviously been left undisturbed for decades. He pulled over and got out, his flashlight beam making a nervous path through the darkness. His thoughts a whirlpool of uncertainty and terror. He stepped back into his cab and sat down, his palm brushing against something on the passenger side. Had he dreamed it all? A hallucination induced by hunger and exhaustion. He glanced down at the little cardboard matchbook that lay on the seat, aged and battered as though it had been there for 50 years, with the words, "The Starlight Diner," written in a looping, happy handwriting on the cover. It had been real, George thought as he stared at it, his blood freezing. He patted his tummy and checked his fuel gauge, which showed full. He felt sad and satisfied, but he also experienced a deep and terrible emptiness, a chilly spot deep inside him, as if the phantom food had nourished his body but had taken something vital from his spirit in exchange. The hollow, painful feeling was gone. We'll go to our 8th story. The air in the Louisiana bayou is different. It's not the same as the diner that wasn't there, and he had a terrible sensation that, as the waitress had promised, a part of him would always be sitting in that silent, sterile, timeless place. Donnie was carrying a load of PVC pipes down a 2-lane state highway that cut through the Atchafalaya Basin, a road that felt less like a modern convenience and more like a temporary truce with a swamp. It's just air, a thick, wet, living thing that sticks to your skin and fills your lungs with the smell of damp earth, sweet decay, and things best left undisturbed. It was just after 2 in the morning, and the site felt ancient and predatory, where the 21st century seemed to have no influence, with ancient cypress trees clothed in Spanish moss standing on either side, like motionless skeletal sentinels, their roots hidden in the inky black water. Donnie was exhausted, his eyes gritted from gazing into the hypnotic tunnel of his headlights, thinking of the greasy but gratifying po' boy he was going to get in Lafayette, when a big form darted from the dense undergrowth on his right. It was the hour when the world is inhabited by ghosts and hunters. The truck shook to a stop, the sudden silence of the cab intensifying the desperate pounding of his own heart, and he felt a sickening heavy thud that reverberated throughout the entire rig, followed by the high-pitched squeal of his brakes as he stomped on the pedal out of instinct. "Damn it," he breathed. He knew the procedure. You don't stop. You call it in. You check your truck for damage when you reach a safe, well-lit place, but you never ever stop on a dark road in the middle of nowhere. He cursed a tiny, insufficient sound in the wide, silent marsh. The idea of abandoning something to suffer on the asphalt nodded at him. But Donnie wasn't built that way. His father had taught him to respect the animals you share the world with, so he turned on his hazard lights with a heavy sigh, their amber flashes painting the surrounding trees in an eerie, pulsing glow. The swamp chorus was a deafening symphony of chirping insects and the deep, guttural croak of bullfrogs. He climbed out of the cab and grabbed his mag light from the passenger seat, a heavy 4-cell beast that was as much a club as a flashlight. He walked toward the front of his truck, the powerful beam of his flashlight cutting a clean white circle through the darkness. It was a deer, a big buck with a gorgeous rack of antlers, or it had been, because one of its front legs was bent back at an impossible, terrible angle. He had expected to discover a deer, perhaps a wild hog, but instead he saw a mangled heap of fur and flesh lying in a dark, spreading pool on the road. Donnie felt a feeling of sorrow and disgust. It was a clean death, at least. The white of the bone, a sharp cut against the dark fur. Its neck was obviously broken, twisted in such a way that it made his own neck hurt in sympathy. He was going to turn away to examine his bumper for damage when the beam of his flashlight struck the deer's eye, which was open and staring directly at him. Quick, there was no jerking, no breathing, just a tragic, motionless bit of roadkill. A chilling knot of dread tightened in Donnie's stomach as he paused. The eye was bright, dark, and focused, and it contained a horrifying, undeniable gleam of intellect, of awareness. It wasn't the blank, glassy stare of a dead animal. He took a tentative step forward, lowering the flashlight beam from the eye, to the corpse needing to see it breathe to see some movement in his gut. It must have been a post-mortem reflex, a trick of the light. Animals occasionally twitched after death, but they didn't watch. The animal was a shattered, damaged monster, but the eye was still on him, unblinking, watching his every move. Then there was a sound. There was no sign of life that would make this less horrible, but the chest was motionless. Donnie's light snapped back to the deer's head, and the buck's neck, the one that was so visibly and horrifyingly broken, started to move, straightening itself out with a series of grotesque, disjointed snaps, not with the fluid motion of muscle, but with a low, wet, clicking noise that sounded like a tree branch slowly being bent to its breaking point. Donnie's breath froze in his throat as the head, which had been lolling on the tarmac, slowly rose and turned to face him directly, both of its dark, perceptive eyes now fixed on his. Bone grated against bone. He took a step back, his boots scuffing on the pavement, and the creature on the ground reacted. This was not conceivable. He was seeing things. A waking nightmare triggered by weariness and the weird atmosphere of the marsh. The broken foreleg started to draw itself in with another set of terrible cracks, but it wasn't healing. Rather, it was rearranging itself, and the broken bone appeared to weave itself back together in a way that went against all biological laws. The legs straightened, the hoof scraping against the asphalt as it found its footing. Then the other. Legs moved, forcing the mangled body higher. It stood, but it was no longer a deer. Its limbs were too long and slender. Its joints seemed to bend in the wrong places, and its height was too great. Its magnificent antlers were no longer symmetrical, but rather twisted and gnarled, resembling the dead branches of a lightning-scorched tree. Its skin appeared to hang loosely from a frame that was little more than bone. Its fur was patchy and matted with blood. Its posture was spidery and unsettling. Donnie didn't scream, but the paralysis of terror that had kept him glued to the spot eventually broke as it made a low, guttural rattle that sounded as though it came from deep within its damaged chest. A sound of enormous suffering, but also of immense ancient desire. Without air, he simply turned and fled, a savage animal fear driving him onward, scurrying for his cab door, his hands fumbling with a handle, and throwing himself inside, slamming and shutting it behind him. He slammed the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator, causing the tires to squeal in protest as the rig lurched forward, gaining speed with excruciating slowness, and he risked a glance in his side mirror. But he didn't look back because he couldn't bear to see it again. He turned on the ignition and the engine roared to life with a sound that was a prayer answered. Driving the rest of the night, Donnie saw the creature standing in the middle of the road, bathed in the red glow of his tail lights, but it wasn't chasing him. Rather, it was just watching him go, its head cocked to one side, and the sight of its silent, motionless pursuit was somehow more terrifying than a desperate chase would have been. He didn't stop until he arrived at the outskirts of Houston, where he pulled into a huge, brightly lit truck stop that seemed like a world apart from the swamp's dark, primordial realm. He left the truck running, the doors locked, and sat there until the sun rose, driving away the worst of the darkness. He forced himself to believe it had been a hallucination, that the swamp had taken over his mind, that he had been exhausted and stressed, and that he needed to see the dent, the blood, the physical evidence of the collision to re-establish the reality of his memory. It was as if the incident had never occurred. The bumper was spotless, with no scratches, blood stains, or deer fur specks. For a brief time he felt a wave of relief. It had been a nightmare, a terrifyingly realistic dream. His eyes landed on the roof of his truck, just above the windshield, and he was about to laugh, a ragged, hysterical sound of a man pulled back from the brink, when he noticed 3 long, deep gouges. They were fresh, the metal underneath gleaming in the morning sun, and they looked as though something with huge, strong claws had dragged itself across the top of his truck while he was driving. Let's go to our 9th story. Roy was a man who believed in rules. He never drove through the Atchafalaya Basin at night again, but occasionally, while on a lonely road, he would see a deer standing on the shoulder, its eyes reflecting in his headlights, and for a heart-stopping, terrifying moment, he would see its head start to turn, its neck beginning to bend at an angle that is horribly, terribly wrong. A professional, a ghost on the highway who did his job quietly and correctly, he had never received a speeding ticket in his 25 years of driving, kept his logbook spotless, maintained his rig with the precision of a mechanic, and adhered to the hours of service regulations to the minute. But on a long, moonless night on a forgotten stretch of U.S. Route 89A in northern Arizona, Roy was about to discover that some things work by a set of rules he could never understand. The rules were a shield, a way to make sense of the chaotic, unpredictable world of the open road, which was a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through a vast geological cathedral. Roy was carrying a load of medical supplies, and the only sounds in his cab were the low rumble of his engine and the soft hiss of the air conditioning, fighting a losing battle against the residual desert heat. On either side, monstrous red, rock formations rose up, their silhouettes like sleeping giants against a star-dusted sky. It was a profoundly empty place, a landscape that made a man feel small and